Imagine someone who flinches at a single critical word online. Their reaction isn't a private hurt, but a public demand for an apology, for a firing, for an institution to wield its power on their behalf. We call them fragile, and we think we understand them. But what if that fragility isn't the cause, but the symptom? What if the real story isn't about a weak character, but a missing structure? I recently watched a person meticulously craft their public identity, a perfect digital avatar of curated tastes and righteous opinions. Offline, they confess a deep, constant anxiety about saying the wrong thing, a fear of being seen incorrectly. Their online persona was a fortress, but it was built on sand, because behind it was nothing. No durable community, no unchosen bonds, no private world to retreat to and be truly known. Their self had become both a shrine and a prison. This isn't a personal failing. It's a societal outcome. We've dismantled the very institutions that once taught us how to be human with each other, outside the watchful eye of the market or the state. We are left atomized, hypersensitive, and preemptively hostile sovereigns of a tiny endangered kingdom called the ego, now demanding the whole world conform to its psychic demands for safety. The fragile tyrant is not born. They are manufactured. And the factory is a void where the family used to be.
That is such a powerful way to frame the issue. It's a really sharp diagnosis of what's happening.
It really cuts through the usual way of talking about this, doesn't it?
It does, because, the standard take is always to focus on the individual character.
Right.
You say people are narcissistic or they're too sensitive, that it's a personal failing.
A weakness.
A weakness, exactly. But what this opening gets at is that the real story is structural. These behaviors we're seeing, this hypersensitivity and this demand for institutional enforcement, they are symptoms of these huge gaps in our social fabric.
Gaps where things used to be.
Yes. I mean, think about the traditional durable social structures that taught resilience or managed disagreement or just provided a sense of real belonging, things that existed, outside of government control. When those erode, the vacuum doesn't just stay empty.
And that's the cycle. The individual's left feeling isolated, completely exposed, and so their feelings become weapons.
And the state or institutions acting like the state, they rush right in to manage that emotional battlefield.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack that exact mechanism. We're going to trace the line from those missing social bonds all the way to the expansion of state power into our personal psychological lives.
Precisely. We're going to look at how the breakdown of what we call intermediary institutions created this atomized, hypersensitive person. And from there, we'll trace the rise of what's known as the therapeutic state.
The therapeutic state.
Right. It's this profound, decades-long shift in what government is supposed to do. It moved away from just being a protector of rights or a dispenser of justice.
And became something much more invasive.
It became an active manager of its citizens' psychological, moral, and even their physical well-being.
So we'll start with the cultural side of things, this void, the victim mindset, this culture of emotivism that fuels the demand for the state to step in.
And then we'll get into the history. We'll trace the actual policy lineage of this shift, starting all the way back in the 19th century with philanthropy.
From there to the progressive era, the casework revolution.
And follow that thread all the way to today to see how the modern state uses things like medicalization and coercive treatment to manage conformity.
Okay, so let's start with that foundation, this architecture of fragility. The core idea is this structural void, what you called the missing middle. And this isn't just, people feeling a bit lonely.
Not at all. It's a very practical sociological reality. It's the decline of what sociologists call associational life or intermediary groups.
And that decline is the key. It's the bridge between someone's private anxiety and the growth of state power.
It's the essential connection. I mean, if you go back and read early observers of America, someone like Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, he was just blown away by the sheer number of voluntary associations in the U.S.
He talks about it constantly.
He was obsessed with it. And these weren't government bodies and they weren't just private families. They were everything in between. Local churches, fraternal organizations.
Reading clubs, civic groups, you name it.
Exactly. And they all stood between the individual and the centralized government, connecting people to society in this really complex, layered way.
And Tocqueville saw these as, like training grounds for democracy.
That's a perfect way to put it. They were where you learned how to be a citizen, how to manage conflict, how to organize something with your neighbors, how to tolerate disagreement, and crucially, how to rely on each other without needing to call a government bureaucrat to solve every little problem.
Which seems incredibly prophetic now.
It's chillingly prophetic.
Yeah.
Because his big worry was, what happens if these intermediary groups decline? He saw two major dangers.
Okay.
First, the isolated individual becomes incredibly vulnerable to the tyranny of the majority. Social pressure just becomes overwhelming.
And the second?
The second is that they become vulnerable to centralized state power. The state steps in to fill the role that the community used to play.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if your neighborhood association falls apart, or your church group, or your union isn't there anymore, where do you go? When you have a problem that's bigger than you, but, smaller than a national crisis.
You turn to the only big authority left. You look to the state. And scholars like Robert Putnam, in books like Bowling Alone, have really documented this decline. When the individual gets detached from these local, durable groups, they become much more susceptible to a certain kind of relationship with the state.
A relationship of dependency.
A dependency, yes. The state becomes a kind of surrogate community. But it's a terrible one because it can only see you as a voter or a taxpayer or a client to be managed.
So you have this isolated, vulnerable person, and that vulnerability then gets supercharged by this cultural shift, the rise of the victim mindset.
Right. And this is the real engine for the state's expansion today, because now society itself is demanding that the state meet its therapeutic needs.
How does that work?
Well, this modern therapeutic way of thinking has a few key features, but one of the most important is the absolute centrality of victimization. It's all about understanding yourself and demanding that other people see you as a victim.
A victim of what, specifically?
A victim of almost anything. A victim of a disease, a pathology, an addiction, a disorder, or oppression. This story, this narrative, establishes the need for an external expert to come in and fix it.
But there's a huge paradox there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because claiming you're a victim sounds like you're giving up power, but in our public conversations, it does the exact opposite.
It grants you a remarkable kind of authority. It's completely counterintuitive, but the victim mindset is actually used as a way to assert power, to leverage institutions.
So if you can successfully brand yourself as a victim in public,
Yeah. You're often given this immediate privileged position. Your claims become very difficult to challenge. It's a form of social currency, and a very powerful one, that people are eager to use because it justifies their demands for protection and enforcement from those institutions.
which brings us right back to the fragile tyrant in the opening. They don't just feel hurt. They demand an institutional response, a firing, an HR investigation, a deplatforming.
Precisely. They are leveraging their claimed injury to get a policy outcome. And the sources are really clear that this is a widespread phenomenon. It's not just, confined to historically oppressed minority groups. It's become a universal tool for gaining power.
You see it across the political spectrum.
Absolutely. The analysis shows that large parts of, say, the disenfranchised white working class, what some people call the Trump demographic, also use this victim ideology very, very heavily.
So they might not be claiming victimhood based on race or gender, but on, say, class or culture or geography.
Exactly. They see themselves as victims of economic neglect or media bias or of cultural elites who look down on them, and they use that language of injury to demand political action.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how the victim mindset has become the default mode for demanding power for basically any group.
So when everybody is starting from this place of claimed injury and trying to leverage their authority as victims, the whole way we debate things has to change. It moves away from reason.
And towards feeling. This is what leads directly to what philosophers call the reign of emotivism.
Emotivism.
It's the idea that moral judgments aren't really about facts at all. They're just expressions of our feelings or attempts to manipulate the feelings of other people.
So appeals to your subjective emotional state become the main way you argue.
They become the dominant form of discourse. It completely replaces reasoned, factual debate.
So if the old idea of civil society was based on the idea that we can all agree on a set of facts, a shared reality, emotivism just blows that up.
It completely undermines it. It makes having a conversation based on shared facts almost impossible. The goal is no longer to convince the other person with logic, which, assumes there's an external reality we both share.
Instead, the goal is to what? Express how deeply you feel something.
Exactly. To express the purity or the depth of your own subjective emotional experience. And by doing that, you delegitimize the other person's argument if it doesn't align with your emotional truth.
So it's not about who has the best rational argument anymore.
No. It's about who can express the deepest emotional outrage, who can perform the most sincere moral injury. And the person who does that most effectively often wins the day, not the person who has the best evidence. It creates this incredibly worrying environment for any kind of real civil discourse.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have these atomized, emotionally fragile citizens who are demanding protection from the state. But that demand only lands because the state has already spent decades building up the tools to manage our psychological and domestic lives. This wasn't something that just happened overnight.
Not at all. And that's the essential insight here. The architecture of the therapeutic state wasn't built by politicians initially. It was built by 19th century philanthropic circles, bourgeois reformers who were deeply worried about what they called marginality.
What were they so afraid of?
Well, you have the rise of industrial capitalism, rapid urbanization, massive immigration. To them, it looked like the entire pre-industrial moral economy was collapsing. They feared social disorder, class conflict, maybe even revolution.
They were worried the working poor would become this huge destabilizing force if their morals weren't properly managed.
Precisely. And so their plan of action became very targeted and, frankly, deeply invasive. And their target was the working class family.
The family itself.
They identified the working class family as the point of contagion for all this social disorder. So the goal was to turn the family into a vehicle for the regeneration of morals. And this mission led to increasingly invasive moralizing intervention, which went way beyond just giving out money.
What did that invasion actually look like in practice? It wasn't just charity.
No, it was about teaching proper thrift, temperance, domestic order, hygiene. These philanthropic visitors, who were usually middle-class women, would make home visits. And they weren't just there to see if you needed money. They were there to assess your moral fitness.
And they wanted the state's help to do this.
They did. They sought state support for projects that required some real authority things like child protection laws and new sanitary regulations.
But here's the tension that seems so critical. They wanted state power for their moral projects, but they were fiercely against the state just giving out material aid.
Vehemently against it. They fought hard against programs like public outdoor relief, which is basically direct, unconditional cash payments to the poor in their homes.
Why? You'd think that'd be the first thing you'd want.
Because they believed it imperiled the family. It undermined the discipline to work and save. In their view, refusing to give unconditional aid was a good disciplinary use of state authority. It was a warning to the working class that you couldn't just get public resources without strict moral compliance.
So that pattern was set early on. State power is good as long as it's enforcing a moral, normalizing agenda that's run by experts.
That's the core pattern right there. And it leads us straight into the progressive era where the diagnosis of the problem shifts. The working class family goes from being seen as morally unfit to being seen as scientifically incompetent.
That seems like a small change in wording, but a huge conceptual leap.
It was the birth of the modern therapeutic approach. Philanthropy started moving beyond just moral condemnation and started aligning itself with the new social sciences. So now the family wasn't sinful, it was pathological. It had diseased conditions that needed expert treatment, not a lecture. They were just suffering from maladjustment.
And this new diagnosis required a new kind of intervention. This is where the caseworker comes in.
Exactly, the caseworker revolution. It was heavily influenced by the medical model, diagnosis, and then treatment. This approach required skillful, sustained contact for what they called family rehabilitation. This wasn't a quick bit of advice. It was long-term, intensive monitoring and management.
The caseworker was basically a psychological doctor for the family unit.
Yes, treating the family's condition as a disease, with specific behavioral and environmental symptoms that needed to be cured.
The ambition of this sounds just staggering. It was total domestic reconstruction.
It was nothing less than a complete restructuring of the way in which the recipient, the client, ran her household. The caseworker's job was to go in, identify, and then selectively destroy these old, non-modern cultural patterns.
Like what?
Like haphazard budgeting or traditional beliefs about child rearing. And then they were supposed to implant new, scientifically approved skills, things like modern hygiene, strict household budgets, and they persistently counseled against ancient practices, like using a midwife for childbirth.
But the people doing this, the social workers, they didn't see themselves as coercive, did they? They saw this as purely helpful, scientific.
And that's the key psychological trick of the therapeutic state. To the progressives, power that was exercised under the banner of science and expertise. It didn't even look like coercion. They defined coercion very narrowly as, the arbitrary use of force.
But their method wasn't arbitrary. It was scientific.
It was non-judgmental. They were just offering expert advice that clients could readily see to be in their own interest. And this scientific, non-judgmental packaging hid what was really a profound encroachment on personal sovereignty. It was an invasion into the deepest parts of domestic life and personal values.
And you see this combination of judicial power and therapeutic technique get formalized in new institutions like the juvenile court.
Yes, the juvenile court is a perfect example. It was designed to occupy this shadowy ground between a legal tribunal and a social agency. The whole point was to get away from the old adversarial criminal system. The court was supposed to treat, not punish.
And its power went way beyond just kids who committed crimes.
Far beyond. Its jurisdiction covered any child who was deemed maladjusted. The court could then apply these advanced therapeutic methods to both the child and the family to prevent future problems.
But how can the power of a court be genuinely therapeutic? I mean, the power imbalance there seems to negate the whole idea of help.
Well, that's the central question, isn't it? The judicial authority was there to reinforce the therapeutic technique. The threat of state power was the ultimate enforcement mechanism for getting people to normalize.
How so?
A probation officer's report wasn't just a legal filing. It could indict a parent's fitness based on whether they were following the caseworker's plan, not just whether they broke a law. And if the parent didn't cooperate with this normalization process,
The court could step in.
the court could use that as a reason to permanently separate the child from the home.
So just resisting the expert's advice was seen as proof that you were an unfit parent?
Precisely. If a family pushed back, the court was right there, ready to order them to comply. The judge's gavel was the final stamp of approval on the social worker's therapeutic plan. The court provided the coercive backbone that made sure the expert's judgment was followed.
And we see the same dynamic of coercive therapy, disguised as kindness, in programs like Mother's Aid or Widow's Pension.
Absolutely. The sources call it permanent scrutiny. Mother's Aid was sold as this wonderful program to keep families together after a father died. But to get the money, the mother had to prove she was a suitable candidate for normalization.
Which involved a pretty thorough investigation.
It started with a deep social inquiry. Home visits, discreet chats with the neighbors, all to establish her eligibility and her competence as a mother. This system basically institutionalized domestic surveillance into the family's most private business.
Can you give me some examples of that surveillance? What were caseworkers actually demanding?
The scrutiny was incredibly intense. They had to do regular visits at least once a month. They often made mothers keep detailed expense reports for as long as they got the aid. The goal was to reform what they called haphazard management.
So they were teaching them how to run a home properly.
They were instructing widows on balanced diets, on cleaning schedules, proper ventilation, even the layout of the house. They would require separate rooms for adolescent male and female children.
The state was literally dictating the architecture of family life in exchange for benefits.
Yes, and if you failed to meet these standards, or if you did something they considered morally suspect, like having a male boarder or an inappropriate dating life, you could lose your benefits. Or, and this is the critical part, they could take your children away.
So the mother was accepting this permanent scrutiny in exchange for the aid.
Exactly. Which proves that the state's very first welfare programs were primarily tools for behavior modification, just disguised as financial help.
So by the time the progressive era ends, the state has built this whole foundation for managing people through psychological diagnosis and conditional aid. It really set the stage for the massive expansion that came later. So let's jump forward to the modern state and its tools. We tend to think of therapy and punishment as total opposites. But a key idea here is that they're not opposites at all. They're complementary.
They work in perfect harmony. The idea that therapeutic methods and judicial power reinforce each other is absolutely crucial, and you can see it so clearly in the modern criminal justice system. Take the whole problem-solving court movement, like drug courts.
Right. On the surface, they seem great. A soft, helping approach. We're going to help the addict with treatment instead of just locking them up.
But our sources argue that this approach can be even more punitive and interventionist than the traditional system.
How can forced therapy be more punitive than prison? That seems backwards.
It's because the state uses the word treatment as a substitute for the word coercion. A nonviolent drug offender, for example, is pushed into court-ordered treatment under incredible duress.
The choice is the program or jail.
Exactly. You have to plead guilty and go into the program, or you face immediate jail time. Now, the therapists involved might claim that accepting treatment is ultimately voluntary, but it's a choice between court supervision and a prison cell.
There's no choice at all.
It's no real choice. And on top of that, the supervision is long, it's invasive, and it's conditional on your internal state. You have to show the right attitude, you have to comply with the therapeutic goals. It's not just about following the law anymore.
So people completing these programs might just be trying to get the judge off their back.
Often, yes. It reflects a desire to be free from the constant meddling and surveillance, not necessarily a genuine, lasting freedom from drug use. The state's coercive power is just being used to enforce a therapeutic goal of personal adjustment.
And this whole apparatus got a huge boost during the Great Depression. That crisis was the moment it all went national.
Yes, the Depression completely exposed how inadequate the old, locally funded systems were. And social workers, being very shrewd, saw a massive opportunity. They used the New Deal programs like FARA and the Social Security Act to get huge federal subsidies,
which extend their influence everywhere.
It created a powerful bureaucratic niche for this therapeutic model at the national level. The goal from Washington was to rationalize the whole system and impose these uniform professional casework standards across the country.
But did local communities just accept this new, federally driven therapeutic agenda?
Oh, not at all. The push for uniform standards often failed. Local relief offices frequently just defied the orders from Washington. They would often replace the therapeutic agenda with what the source material calls time-honored economic moralism.
What does economic moralism look like on the ground?
It was basically local community opinion taking over. It often led to these really harsh, punitive attitudes towards people getting aid, which was the total opposite of the non-judgmental therapeutic stance.
Can you give an example?
It was especially clear in the South, where local sentiment often held that single Black mothers ought to work, no matter what their childcare situation was, or if they were eligible for aid. Local agencies had the discretion to enforce those moral standards, and the way the system was set up, separating contributory social insurance like Social Security from means-tested public assistance like welfare. It just politically isolated the welfare recipients and made them easy targets for this kind of local moral judgment.
So moving forward from there, the biggest, most dramatic expression of the therapeutic state has to be the total medicalization of everyday life. This seems to be the new frontier for state expansion.
It is a dramatic, data-driven expansion. I mean, look at the explosion in the use of pharmacological drugs. Ritalin for kids' behavior, Prozac, and other antidepressants for mood. The use of these drugs just skyrocketed from the late 90s on.
And the spending.
The public expenditure is astounding. Between 1960 and 1998, public spending on healthcare per person went up more than 100 times.
That kind of spending suggests that, as a society, we've elevated health to a kind of moral command.
We have. The modern therapeutic state sees health as a paramount moral value, maybe the highest value. And this ideology completely transforms private health, which you would think is about individual responsibility, into public health, which immediately becomes the state's responsibility. And that ideological shift is what justifies coercing people to protect them from themselves.
That's such a critical distinction. We all accept the state stepping in to stop communicable diseases to protect the public. But here, the state is intervening because it's decided that my unhealthy lifestyle is a public problem.
Exactly. The line between public health preventing you from endangering others and private health making yourself healthy gets completely erased. The logic is, if the community is paying for your treatment, which we now do through massive public spending, then the state has a right to manage your personal behavior to lower the risk of you getting sick.
So the state starts regulating private lifestyles, even when they pose no direct threat to anyone else.
Because the state has taken on the financial and moral burden of your personal well-being.
And this whole expansion is often sold to us using these powerful metaphors.
Yes. The metaphor of war is incredibly effective. The war on drugs, the war on cancer, it mobilizes huge resources, and it justifies a dramatic, unquestioned expansion of what the state can do. These wars replace personal responsibility with massive government programs and legal penalties. I mean, the war on drugs alone was costing $19 billion a year back in the late 90s.
And the sources uncover something truly shocking, which is the state using clandestine control over media to push these therapeutic goals.
It's a stunning example of subverting free speech for a political goal. Government agencies were secretly censoring TV scripts. The broadcast networks were required to match the value of federal anti-drug ads with their own public service announcements.
Yeah.
But here was the loophole.
Ah.
If the Drug Czar's office approved a TV show's anti-drug storyline, say, a character decides not to do drugs or confronts a dealer, the show itself could be counted towards that PSA requirement.
So the networks had a financial incentive to let a government board review and approve the content of their fictional shows.
It was a system of clandestine control. It wasn't like old-fashioned censorship. The people doing it knew they were bypassing democratic values, but they justified it by saying they were using every lawful means to save America's children. The public had no idea that the moral content of the shows they were watching had been vetted by a federal script board.
And this therapeutic lens, it doesn't just stop at big things like drugs. It relentlessly expands to manage just ordinary emotional distress.
Yeah.
It turns normal human experiences into medical problems.
This is maybe the most pervasive step of all, the medicalization of distress.
Yeah.
A perfect example is the massive expansion of the diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The whole diagnosis rests on turning the idea of trauma from a physical injury into a purely psychological one.
Right. Historically, trauma meant a wound, something caused by an external force.
But the new therapeutic view says you just have to be exposed to it or witness it. Merely seeing a traumatic event or even just hearing about it is now enough to make you a candidate for PTSD. And that means you require immediate, often preventative, mental health care.
Which leads to what the sources call imposed grief.
Exactly. Counseling is now routinely and sometimes forcibly imposed on people, on kids whose classmate dies, on adults who are relatives of crash victims, even if they never asked for it.
So what past generations would have just called grief or tragedy or sadness, things that required time and family and community to get through, is now instantly redefined as a pathological state that has to be managed by an expert.
It's turned into a medical problem. The sources point out that in the past, this kind of intrusion into private grief would have been seen as ugly meddling. But today, we just accept it as necessary mental health care. The therapeutic sector can't allow for unmanaged emotional life.
And to make this whole system work, you need the average citizen to become an enforcer, the informant citizen.
Yes. Kids and adults are taught, often from grade school on, to report the misbehavior of their siblings, their parents, their classmates. Not just crimes, but anything that might signal emotional distress or an addiction.
And it's all sold as promoting mental health or drug prevention.
It makes every citizen a frontline enforcer of therapeutic norms.
So that impulse to judge and denounce other people, the same thing we see online. It gets laundered and presented as helping.
Exactly. The focus on helping others often just masquerades as helping, but its real function is to constantly encourage the medicalization of blameless bad deeds, like, normal teenage rebellion, and turn them into signs of a pathology. The whole structure creates a constant demand for intervention, and it ensures there's always a steady supply of helpless people to keep all the helpers happy.
So once the state is managing this whole psychological landscape and funding this huge therapeutic sector, the role of the ordinary citizen has to change completely. This leads us to the triumph of rationalization over politics.
Yes. The growth of the therapeutic sector fit perfectly with the ideals of the progressive public administration movement. They wanted an efficient state, free from the contamination of politics.
They saw politics as messy.
They saw it as messy, and they believed complex social issues were basically just technical problems that were best solved by experts, not by public debate.
So you get this deeply technocratic approach. It's all about smooth service delivery, not democratic input.
It is. The approach favored expert administrative skills over citizen action. All the policymaking was kept inside this closed circle of experts, social scientists, and department managers. They were the ones who were supposed to figure out what citizens needed and act in their best interest.
Which creates a really truncated idea of what it means to be a citizen.
That's the perfect word for it. It's truncated. The reformers just assumed that providing material benefits and services, better housing, clean water, financial aid, was the sum total of political membership.
If the state is giving you efficient scientific solutions that make your life better, what more could you possibly want?
Right. And so citizenship becomes this passive thing. The active, deliberating citizen that Tocqueville saw is replaced by the passive recipient of services.
You're just a collection of needs that the bureaucracy has to meet.
Exactly. You're just supposed to express your general satisfaction with the services you receive. It confirms the government's claim that it can serve you better than you could ever serve yourself.
And as this therapeutic sector grew up, especially by the 1960s, this led to something even more dangerous. Just unchecked professional hubris.
By the 60s, therapeutic thinking had become dangerously isolated. It was cut off from other academic disciplines that might have questioned its claims. And as a result, the sources say that no force existed to check the expanding hubris of social personnel.
They were operating with this unbound ambition, convinced they could solve these massive social and economic problems just by adjusting an individual's psychology.
That's it. Social workers, armed with this simplified psychoanalytic knowledge, expressed unbound ambition. They really believed they could treat the multi-problem family, the kind of client that had almost no resources to pull themselves up, a much harder group than their progressive predecessors had faced.
And they saw it as a technical challenge.
An intriguing technical challenge. They were convinced that their therapeutic methods could overcome even the most severe maladjustment through this intensive process of normalization.
Even though the evidence that it worked was shaky at best.
It was. The sources point to the flimsy evidence that this intensive casework actually produced positive results. The studies they did were often poorly designed. They tried to quantify things that couldn't be quantified, but the results always confirmed what the practitioners wanted to believe.
Which is that their science worked, and if it failed, it was the client's fault for resisting.
Exactly. But the sources suggest that the ultimate promise of this therapeutic power, this idea that you could completely reconstruct a person's values and attitudes, it was never really achieved.
It has not been. And the core problem is that the individual client is still so vulnerable when this system fails. I mean, despite all the sophisticated claims, the practitioners regularly fail to make accurate assessments. Agencies mishandle the treatment, and yet the client still has to go through it. So how did the client fight back against this system that was failing them?
Well, their resistance was mostly passive. It was superficial compliance. They would nod and agree in the sessions. They'd fill out the expense reports.
But they wouldn't fundamentally change their inner lives or their values?
No. The therapeutic practitioners, for all their claims of scientific rigor, were never able to get beneath appearances. And that illustrates the fundamental failure of this science's ideology that was driving the whole movement.
So the therapeutic state wanted a power that could reach into the deepest parts of the human soul, a power that would let it completely reconstruct a person's values.
But that positive power, the power implicit in this technology of adjustment, it was never achieved. The clients were often left defenseless when the intervention failed or was misapplied, but they still held on to this small, critical zone of autonomy just by refusing to give their genuine internal compliance. They resisted the state's deepest invasion of their personal sovereignty.
So if we circle all the way back to the beginning, it feels like we've successfully traced that fragile tyrant, that hypersensitive person demanding institutional backup back to the factory where they're made.
And that factory is, first, a structural void. It's created by the decline of those durable community bonds, that associational life we talked about.
And second, that void was eagerly filled by a state that uses therapeutic justification for its power. It defines ordinary life problems, emotional pain, even bad behavior, as medical diseases that require some kind of coercive or conditional intervention.
And this whole expansion is driven by the cultural belief that the individual is basically incompetent to manage their own life and needs a paternalistic state to do it for them. And that's what turns private health and psychological well-being into these managed public concerns.
Which fundamentally changes what the state is. When the government is managing health and well-being and emotion, its whole identity shifts. It stops being a guardian of liberty, where its power has clear limits.
And it becomes a highly sophisticated, pervasive manager of conformity.
Exactly. The expansion of the state isn't justified by, external threats or economic crises anymore. It's justified by psychological necessity. And the result is a society where the external use of power is validated by its claim to scientific expertise, ensuring that the passive citizen remains a client to be managed rather than an active participant in their own self-governance.